Welcome back, everybody. This is going to be our last lecture before the second exam. And what we're going to be doing in this particular lecture is really finally tying a lot of the language concepts that we talked about in our previous lecture to the developmental ideas and kind of time spans that we've been looking at in previous classes. What we're going to do to kind of understand this is start where we typically start. In particular, we're going to start at birth and kind of the early stages of life. What we see with language development is that even though there's considerable research to suggest that languages in particular aren't heritable, so if you don't have, say, a Spanish-speaking gene or an English-speaking gene or any other type of language-speaking gene, what we do seem to have is a very high predisposition for learning languages and developing languages right at birth. Most infants, even though they don't necessarily all start and end at the exact same time, tend to display the same early rudimentary sets of language that help in survival. What we see is that at birth, almost all children are capable of crying, and this is usually meant to display some type of displeasure. Usually it relates to kind of almost a reflexory ability to get what needs we have to be met. As we start to progress, the early vocalizations transition from crying, not crying, to actually being able to express other sounds that usually start to display not just kind of a lack of being upset, but instead some type of joy or pleasure. Most parents often call this particular sound making cooing, and we do see oftentimes variations from child to child as to what cooing looks like. Some will gurgle, some will kind of hum, some will make weird yippy sounds. It kind of depends on the child as to what develops in terms of the cooing that they make. But usually this cooing is the first indications that these children can convey pleasure, not just a need that has to be met. And usually cooing advances for about 2 to 3 months, and eventually children start going beyond just kind of labeling things as good and bad in their communications and start to try to kind of pick up on the language around them that they're starting to be able to detect. Looking at the first inklings that children are not only attentive to language, but maybe trying to develop language skills on their own, we tend to see is that around 6 months of age, children start to make kind of more random sounds that we tend to call babbling. And these random sounds can sometimes come together to make sounds that almost sound like words. But most researchers have argued that this is kind of their first early attempts to produce those phonemes that we talked about earlier, those basic elements of sound. Essentially, kids are trying to dictate how they're able to make some of the sounds that are essential components to their own languages that they're being exposed to. Now, it's really important to note, though, that when we talk about language, there is other components to language that are forming beyond just conveying information with spoken language. What we see is that many children can already start to recognize specific sounds that relates to language even at birth. And in fact, numerous studies have shown that if you change the phonemes, the sounds that you're making, that habituation topic that we've talked about previously starts to kick in, where when they hear a new sound, they experience dishabituation and they attend for at least a little period of time to that new sound that's being presented. As kids start to grow up and get a little bit older, they also start to recognize the kind of pauses between words and the pauses between consonants in our spoken language. It takes a lot of work to be able to actually do this. And we tend to take it for granted when we hear somebody speaking that the subtle pauses between words are much larger than the subtle pauses between consonants. But it's not always quite as easy as we think. Just to appreciate how tough it is for children to detect the barriers between words instead of just consonants, I put up a video from an older movie that you probably saw maybe when you were a young child, the movie called The Lion King. And it's one of the more famous scenes in the movie where main character encounters two of the other main characters, and they sing this really interesting song called Hakuna Matata. The twist to it is that it's sung in Mandarin. And what I'd love for you to do in watching this video is try to see if you can find the breaks between not consonants but words. My guess is that when they're singing, you might be able to pick up on it because you can probably relate these things to each other. But when they speak, I'm guessing it's going to sound like a bunch of random phonemes that you can't really pick up on whether or not you're transitioning from phoneme to phoneme or from word to word. And that's the challenge for kids when they're born. Now, of course, if you speak Mandarin, then this whole task is thrown for a loop. But if you don't, you should really appreciate the challenges that kids go through in the first couple months of life, trying to differentiate between not only the sounds that are made, but the pauses and what they indicate with language. As kids get a little bit older, some of those attention skills that we talked about before start to pick up, and they allow children to really start to pick up on elements to language that are critical for them to understand morphemes and other more complex parts of language. One of the things that we mentioned earlier, which we said was critical for language development, the ability to gaze follow, develops again at around 10 to 11 months. This is also paired with children's ability to start to gesture, which allows for them, if they do have certain things that they want to display but can't find the sounds for it, to communicate meaning and get ideas across much more quickly. In fact, there's a whole new area of research and interest that relates to something called baby sign that's picked up in popularity over the last couple decades. It's this kind of interesting thing that we've discovered where babies can actually sign things much faster than they can speak things. People have looked at whether or not this enriches or maybe diminishes the speed at which children can learn language. It's a tough topic to try to tackle in a class like this, but I want us to appreciate here that, again, children are not just developing spoken language skills in the first year or so of life. They're also developing a lot of other related skills that can enhance language abilities later on. As we transition from infancy into childhood, our attention gets drawn back to the production of language. And we go from just being able to express sounds and starting to develop basic phonemes to actually producing our very first words. Most children, somewhere between the ages of 10 months and 15 months, will speak their first word, and it will usually be celebrated as this monumental thing by families. I know some of you, when you see that range, might suggest that you spoke a little bit earlier than others, or you know of somebody that spoke a little bit earlier between 10 months or before 10 months. This might be the case, but it's also important to note that as developmental psychologists, the definition of the first words is that the child needs to be able to not only say that word consistently, but have meaning tied behind it and also have intent when that word is produced. It's often that children will produce strings of sounds together that sort of sound like words, and parents will often label them as first words. But if we're looking at consistency and first words being produced on call, usually it's again between about 10 and 15 months of age that children produce this. And again, we celebrate it. But it's also important to note that developmental psychologists have contended that this is big, but not necessarily that big. And that's because by the time children are able to speak their first word, they typically actually have a very robust, what we call receptive vocabulary, where they can identify around 50 words at this point. Not only that, but usually you think of this first word as kind of this segue into this huge growth in vocabulary. They often call this the vocabulary spurt. But what we see is that this first word or first couple words that a child will speak aren't usually the introductions into this dramatic, what we call a vocabulary spurt. Actually, often a couple months before a child is able to go from just 1, 2, or 3 words to the dozens of words that they already know. And that considerable gap is really interesting to researchers, that we can know lots of words and understand them, but not necessarily speak the vast majority of them. And this really highlights kind of the end of infancy into the transition to childhood, where our language skills are there, but they're kind of developing at different rates and they're producing kind of unusual outcomes. When we transition into true childhood, what we start to see is the emergence of a lot of the different language skills that we discussed in our previous lecture. Two-word utterances and the use of morphemes for the very first time really starts to become prominent at the very end of that infancy and beginning of childhood stage. Then we very quickly, within a few months, go from two-word utterances to three-word, four-word, five-word, and beyond utterances, which eventually starts to form sentences. And that really speaks to the fact that children are not only at this point just learning words and sounds and everything else, but they're also learning syntax. They're learning how to combine words into things that sort of make sense. And the syntax they use at a very young age is usually extremely rudimentary, my ball or something like that, but it's useful nonetheless, and it's kind of the precursor to the development of other syntax skills as they progress. The development also at this age for children is sort of dependent upon how much exposure these children have to different languages. There's numerous studies that have shown that children who are exposed to multiple languages tends to be better off as they get into later childhood and early adolescence when it comes to language skills. But at this point, because of the multitude of different phonemes and different rules of language that they're exposed to, children who are, say, bilingual or trilingual tend to show kind of a slowing in this area, which is sometimes a cause for concern of parents, and they need to be usually told by either developmental psychologists or pediatricians that this slowing is totally expected and the end result will be fine, because usually these children do have a better grasp of a lot of the rules of language than most of their peers. It just takes them a little bit longer to really solidify these rules at this age. But regardless of kind of the exposure that a child has, usually by the time a child reaches around 3, 2, 3, 4 word utterances and the basic makeup of syntax is starting to form within the heads of these children. Once we get past that cutoff, what we also see is that there is a huge growth in the vocabulary of children. Now, oftentimes we talk about the vocabulary spurt that occurs from around a year to 2 years of age, but this spurt actually continues on for many, many months after that. In fact, some scientists have argued that children are essentially learning a new word every waking hour for approximately 3 or 4 years of their life. Now, these numbers have been disputed. There's also a lot of arguments that essentially kids are learning lots of words on certain days and only a few words on others. And some of the vocabulary we're learning is more topic specific that might not necessarily carry over with us throughout our entire life. But nonetheless, for around 4 years, children are learning words at a rate that will never be matched in their lifetime. It doesn't mean that around 6, children stop learning massive amounts of words. In fact, the estimates are that at that point, they're only learning a measly 8 words a day for a couple of years. Obviously, that's still much better than most of us adults. But, that word mastery ability that children have has been something that's baffled researchers in cognitive psychology for years. If we're looking at neurological connections, if we're looking at cognitive capabilities, many cognitive psychologists have argued that this shouldn't be possible. And it again speaks to not necessarily an innate ability to master language, but maybe a high proclivity to develop language skills for not only young kids, but all human beings. Because as we're learning that, we're also learning lots of really cool combinations of sounds that need to come together for us to say things correctly. Essentially, we're learning the morphemes that we talked about earlier and the weird morphology rules that each language had. Classic example is if I say, I ate a apple. I'm not actually saying that correctly. I need to say I ate an apple or I ate a cookie. And children can really struggle with the difference between and an, or I pet the cats, or pet the cats. I ran the race versus run the race. Saying words differently, pet, pet, ran, run, can be confusing to kids. But nonetheless, as they're growing in their language, they're also picking up on these subtle morphology differences. So by the time many kids are in first or second grade, most of them are hitting on the correct ways to say phrases, the correct morphemes to use in these specific instances. And all of this is kind of coinciding with the other really big spurts in syntax learning and other things that, again, we tend to take for granted as adults, but really pushing the cognitive boundaries for many children in these childhood years. It is important to mention here, though, that there has been a lot of research that's examined the differences from child to child in terms of language development. When we talk about kind of the average number of words a child learns a day, there has been a lot of research that's shown that these averages might somehow be skewed to kind of looking at specific groups of individuals that are exposed to a lot of information. When we broaden the scope of who we're looking at, those averages do seem to tick down a little bit in terms of how many words a child is learning per day and also how much exposure a child has to a robust vocabulary each day. One of the classic earlier studies that's kind of looked at how language differences start to emerge in childhood has focused on SES groups. I don't necessarily like that comparison because there's a lot of connotation behind that, essentially implying that people who are coming from higher earning families automatically are smarter and do more things for their children. So it kind of bothers me that we have to reference this stuff sometimes, but the vast majority of early childhood exposure research does tend to group people on these lines. And they've shown that essentially families who are coming from lower income groups who are struggling more to kind of give children more robust education exposure tend to have children that develop language at a slower rate. And by the time a lot of these children reach adolescence/adulthood, the vocabulary that they have is significantly smaller than the vocabulary of people who have been exposed to what we would maybe call professional families or professional environments where there is a lot more exposure to a wider range of vocabulary and greater use of the different rules of vocabulary of language that are critical for, I guess, development in the child. If we look at other studies that have examined kind of exposure to vocabulary and kind of limited exposure to vocabulary, we see something similar. It's just unfortunately, again, if you look in the history of research on this, this is one of the areas where lots of early research focused. And it's something that's also led to the consideration of interventions that we should be doing for individuals growing up in kind of more impoverished environments. The suggestion that it might be kind of inherent that the world that these kids are being exposed to is not giving them what they need to develop the vocabulary that they would be expected to have as they get into adulthood. The take-home message I want you to get from this is that the more we're exposed to in terms of language, the more we tend to develop in these childhood years. Now, as we transition into the very late periods of childhood, what we tend to see is that, again, the growth in language starts to kind of taper off, not significantly, but it does taper off to an extent. And children start to really focus their attention on kind of the more upper levels of language development. Children start to, around 5 or 6, develop for the very first time pragmatic speech skills, where they learn to talk to people in different ways or across different situations, speak differently. And they also really start to increase their syntax skills, so that the formation of really structurally sound statements starts to pop up in children when they get into these late childhood years. And trying to figure out why this is the case has been kind of a goal of many developmental psychologists. Some have argued that maybe it's about brain formation and the development of some of the areas that we're going to be talking about at the very end of this lecture. Others have argued that it's probably a byproduct of the introduction of schooling and of the encouragement of proper language and proper use of words that comes with people that maybe aren't around these kids throughout their entire early childhood. Because unfortunately, many parents can often deduce what a child's trying to get at, so they don't push them to be clear, and the teacher will often, not knowing exactly what a child's getting at, kind of pull out of them this kind of insistence on being much more clear in exactly what a child's trying to get across. Now, it's also important to note that in late childhood, we go beyond just spoken language, and children usually start to turn a lot of attention to written language. Usually, most children, by the time they're around 5 or 6, can identify most of their letters, if not all of their letters. In fact, there's numerous children that can identify all their letters by around 2 or 3, but the vast majority of the population can identify all of their letters by around 5. And this is true for most languages. Some languages where there's a multitude of symbols, much more than the 26 that we have in the English language, we see that it takes a little bit longer for children to recognize all of those symbols. But typically, in most languages, the entire alphabet, all the symbols linked to different sounds, usually can be identified by kids. And then the combination of those symbols becomes a focus in the first year or two of schooling, which means from around 5 to 7, there's a big focus in learning how the different symbols represent sounds and how you combine those sounds to make words. Now, there's also been a debate within the developmental psychology area of how to best kind of teach children to combine the sounds together to make words. In the past, a couple decades ago, there was an insistence by many developmental psychologists and pediatricians that the best way to get children to learn how to read was to use what's called the phonics approach. Recognize the sounds that words make. Actually, sounds that letters make, and kind of combine them into words. In the early 2000s, there was sort of a transition to a different approach called the whole language approach that essentially focused on teaching kids sight words, how to recognize kind of the most common words that you would encounter and essentially memorize each and every word. Now, some languages do require this whole language approach when it comes to written language, since some languages have symbols for specific words, not combinations of phonemes or letters, I guess, that come together to produce words. But in the English language and many other languages in Europe and in most countries, this debate between whether or not we should be teaching kids sounds or whole words raged for quite some time. If we're looking at our current stance in educational fields, we tend to see is that most people now, when looking at 5 and 6 year olds, have argued that we shouldn't really be choosing one or the other. We should really do a combination of the two. There's a belief that children should learn what's called common sight words, words that they're exposed to a lot in writing, especially the ones that don't make intuitive sense as to why they produce specific sounds or words. The classic example is the word the. There's no reason why they make that sound until you learn about how T and H produce that very unique phoneme. But instead of trying to sound out the over and over again, there's a lot of research suggests to just teach the kid that the combination of letters makes the word the is enough, and it can help with reading at that point. But with other words that are a little bit less common. The phonics approach is returned as kind of the key element to helping kids learn words. And this really shows how not only are kids attuned to learning written language, but adults, teachers, parents also recognize that at this age, kids are ready to learn written language, and kids really do need to master that since their spoken language skills usually are well beyond what they're capable of doing in written language. It's really important to note here, though, when we're talking about these differences in development, that this is something that's probably inevitable. Most children really do have a lot of catching up to do when it comes to written language once they start, because they're really just getting into a point in their physical development and also mental development that would even allow them to start to explore written language in the first place. Fine motor skills, something we talked about a number of classes ago, are really basic at around the age of 5 or 6. And the myelination required, the amount of neurons required, the fine twitch muscles that are required are not often there in many children to be able to write until around 4 or 5 years of age. And even then, it's not that their presence is enough for a child to write something very clearly. Usually, it requires big writing and lots of repetition for those motor skills to develop to the point where a child can write something that's really coherent and legible for somebody trying to read what this child is writing. This is paired with the fact that children are still, at this point, just starting to recognize the symbols that are in front of them. You can often see this with children reading for the very first time, where they know the symbols in front of them when they're seeing them, but to be able to produce them on their own, to be able to hit them 100% of the time is a challenge. So it makes writing a very choppy, kind of challenging thing in the early stages. We also see is that because there are so many different elements to language, like syntax and semantics, and also kind of trying to get a message across that we haven't even really talked about, that the challenges that children have, which is the basic elements of writing, causes them to not be really capable of attending to a lot of these different skills at about this age. The end result is that usually for many children and even adolescents, our writing skills are far behind our language skills. Speaking of adolescence, what we do see is that even though the vocabulary spurt stops at about this time, there are other growths in vocabulary that are worth noting in adolescence. One of the things that we tend to see is that the use of vocabulary starts to pick up in adolescence. Many children essentially have, even by the time they're in late childhood, a big difference between their receptive vocabulary and their spoken vocabulary. Essentially, kids just don't use as many words as they know. As we get into adolescence, those two vocabularies start to align a little bit more. Another thing that starts to really pick up in adolescence is the use of very good pragmatic skills, where we start to really hone in on the appropriateness of language and cater our language to the group that we're around. And this can often result in effective communication, but it also can result in some odd things as well. You might have, if you've ever been around a teenager, noticed that when they're with their friends, they almost speak a foreign language with lots of weird combinations of sounds and statements that seem nonsensical to adults, but is completely appropriate and actually very intelligible amongst the group. And this really shows the growth in pragmatic skills that are happening in many adolescents. There's also the growth, and this can sometimes be very frustrating for parents, the ability to play with language. So kids do start to develop a propensity for sarcasm and satire, and they start to really focus on how you can kind of play with language and say things and do things that might not make sense to one person but can make perfect sense to another. This is a very important developmental process, and it's critical for children to really, adolescents, I guess, at this point, to transition into adulthood. But again, it can sometimes result in some frustration for parents and peers that maybe aren't a part of the inner groups of these adolescents. Once we get to adulthood, this huge growth in language does start to taper off a bit. But it is important to note that there's numerous studies that have shown that even though we're maybe not learning words nearly at the rate that we were before, most of us continue to increase our both receptive vocabulary and our spoken vocabulary throughout most of our adulthood. We also see, though, that based on how fast we were growing and what we were exposed to, that there are usually some lifelong differences from person to person as to kind of how big our vocabularies are going to be. There are ways to increase our vocabulary once we reach adulthood, but essentially, the argument has been made that those doors are often closed for us to be able to pick up on a lot of language and to be able to kind of recognize a lot of different nuances to language that are kind of present and we're capable of learning once we get into those latter years of our life. There's also been a lot of research that's looked at something we referenced before, the ability to pick up on a second language once we reach adulthood. And there's been numerous studies to show that even though we can oftentimes pick up on another language when we reach adulthood, the ability to pick up on the nuances of those languages, to kind of recognize syntax, to pick up on pauses, to pick up on the really critical phonemes of the language, is not necessarily there. So essentially, if you try to learn a second language in adulthood, you can do it, but it's gonna be rough and it's not only going to be challenging, but your ability to speak that language is probably always going to be greatly diminished and kind of sound weird to people that speak that language fluently. And it shows that essentially that the kind of growth that we need to go through in those childhood years might be somewhat painful and it might have a lot of steps involved, but it does result in the development of a skill that we tend to take for granted as adults. As we get into the latter years of our life, there are some shifts to language that kind of shows some of the declines that we've talked about in other areas. But most research has suggested that really a lot of these drops in language that we see in the much latter years of our life are really a byproduct of other things going on. People do tend to show a decline in the kind of, what am I going to try here? It's kind of interesting example. The ease which we can recall things and the expanse in the amount of words that we use on any given day. And a lot of research has suggested that this is linked to some of the declines in memory that we talked about before. And one of the phenomena that kind of comes with this is something that I sort of intentionally just exposed there, something called the tip of the tongue phenomena, where many people have certain words that they'd like to use, but they're just not as easily recalled. It's tougher to get them up to the surface. And it can often result in a lot of frustration with kind of the challenges of tapping into certain memories that maybe aren't as accessed as they were when we were younger. It also results in kind of declines in the speed of spoken language and the coherence of spoken language. Some of this has been tied to other physical declines, like the decline in our hearing, where many people who are older take longer to process what they're being told because they have to fill in lots of blanks because they can't hear everything they're being told. But also, it kind of relates to the slower reaction times, both physically, so our mouth doesn't move quite as fast, and mentally, where the connections take longer to work once we get into our latter years of life. Essentially, it means that our vocabulary drops a little bit, and the speed at which we speak drops a little bit, but it seems to be a little bit more pronounced because in combination, these effects can be fairly robust. But it's really also important to note that these effects that tend to be robust aren't often as noticeable until we start to see real declines in memory and real declines in reaction time that are usually paired with degenerative things like Alzheimer's disease or other types of kind of mental declines that happen through different problems and ailments that pop up in the latter years of our life. This decline of language that we spoke about earlier really brings up an important topic that was actually at the forefront of research in language as the field was starting to grow. And that's whether or not our amazing abilities to learn language and the ability to hold on to it for so long is something that was innate within human beings, or I guess unique to human beings. Many early researchers looking at learning and language skills tested whether or not other species could be capable of developing some of the elements of language that we sort of take for granted as human beings. And what we found is that, yes, other species can pick up on language, but we do seem to be uniquely inclined to having language skills that not be really replicated across any other species. And this leads us to the question of, well, why? Why are human beings so unbelievably unique? One of the things that we see that could explain this is that our brains do actually have a number of areas on the left side of our temporal lobe that seem to be directly dedicated to the development of language skills. One area that's gained a lot of attention over the years is an area near the back of our temporal lobe called Wernicke's area, which seems to be critical in the formation of coherent statements. The other area that seems to be really critical in the production of language is an area that's actually closer to the front of the temporal lobe and actually creeps into the back of the frontal lobe, called Broca's area. And we think this area is actually responsible for a lot of the production, the physical production of our spoken language. We also have another area that's kind of meshed in between the two that's responsible for written language, and a lot of paths that help coordinate all the different areas we need to be able to kind of understand the language that we're being presented. Essentially, our brain is ripe with areas that are attuned to all the different elements of language that are out there. And we don't often see these areas present in almost any other species that's out there. There are other species that communicate in very amazing ways. We could talk about whales and birds and bees and all these other species that have found ways of communicating with each other, but none of them seem to have this particular pathway and all these elements to it that allow for this huge upswell in language skills that we see from infancy into adulthood. It doesn't seem to be just random coincidence that as these parts of the brain are developing during infancy and childhood and even adolescence, they coincide with growths in a lot of the language skills that they're associated with. We also notice that a lot of our other skills cognitively that are kind of uniquely human seem to enhance our language skills. I've mentioned joint attention numerous times now because it is one of these things that, even though we don't think of it as that big of a deal, it's critical for the development of language. Being able to understand what somebody else is referencing can help enrich our abilities to pick up on language in ways that we really don't often appreciate. And not only do we have this, but we've also learned ways to kind of enhance language skills almost innately. You remember back to our Vygotsky section, we talked about scaffolding. It's a very effective tool at getting individuals to learn concepts a little bit faster than they probably could on their own. Well, numerous researchers have argued that something that we innately do around children called baby tone. You might actually have caught yourself doing this, where you get significantly louder, a little bit more high pitched, and you slow down your vowels. So when you say hello to a baby, you don't say hello, you say hello. kind of that high-pitched, weird thing where you're slowing down the E's and the O's. Well, there's a lot of research to suggest that that behavior that we commit can actually help children learn language a little bit faster, because one of the most difficult things to pick up on for children are those vowels. And also, when speaking baby tone, we also help with those pauses between words that we talked about earlier. The belief is by many developmental psychologists and also evolutionary psychologists that this thing that's kind of just naturally inclined within us is another reason why human beings are kind of uniquely situated to be able to pick up on language and all the different nuances to language that we've talked about better than any other species out there. Leads us to is the conclusion that it kind of makes sense that it takes us a long time to develop language, because we are amazingly capable of picking up on things that no other species is capable of doing, at least that we know of. And it kind of takes time for us to develop all the nuances to language that are actually out there. I'm going to mark the end of where we're going to kind of close out this second section of the material. That means that it's time to start studying for that second exam if you haven't already. And then after the second exam, obviously the completion of the write-ups for this module, we're going to be moving on to our very last section of material in socio-emotional development. So make sure that you've reviewed everything before you take the exam, and be ready, because when we get into the last area of topics, we are going to be covering some things that often are very intuitive to people, but are filled with terms and concepts that sometimes do get a little bit muddled. So make sure you're putting in the effort for this particular section, and then get ready for the last big hurrah on social emotional development when we come back. For now, make sure you're studied up, take care, and hope to see you soon.